Perfect. All right, I'm going to unmute, so just FYI.
Hey, Mary.
It's recording. Yep. Hi, folks. Can you hear me now? Can someone message if you're on the Zoom? Let me know if you can hear me.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? We're lucky that the vaunted nor'easter went further north, apparently. So it's very nice to see so many of you here. The strong kind, as Benedict says, the Cenobites. But we are also being live streamed for people who didn't brave the weather and are not Cenobites. So bring your A game if you ask any questions. It's being recorded. My name is Jeremy Wilkins. We're proceeding on the presumption that everybody knows who we are up there. Because I forgot to get organized for introducing people, except Ligita, which we'll have, about whom we'll have a few things to say. But the order of our proceedings is that I will speak for a few minutes and then hand the rostrum over to my colleague Dominic Doyle, who will speak for a few minutes. And then we will have Ligita come and rebut us, as she has been doing for 6 years. So that seemed like the logical order of things. And then one thing I'm supposed to mention, we have only, I think, 3 copies of this book on hand for sale. But we also have a discount ordering flyer if you're persuaded, as you should be, to go buy it after these representations of it. You can get this flyer, I think, on the table out there or from Mary. I think those are the introductory things I was supposed to say. So welcome, everybody. It's certainly a pleasure to have you here. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be at this rostrum to say a few words in praise of an exceptional book by a very gifted theologian and a dear friend, and most of all, a true Christian. There are many others who might have been invited to this duty, and some of them are here in this room, so I feel particularly grateful to have been asked. I'd like to use my brief time this evening to do 5 things, but only in a highly schematic manner. First, I will propose to give a very brisk summary of the book for those who have not read it. Then I suggest 4 points of reflection on the primacy of Christ and his cross, which were stimulated by the book, connect to its leading themes, and indicate, I should hope, some fruitful lines for future development. In a sense, then, my goal is to honor Ligita's book by posing some questions to it and from it. First, the book in hand was once an ambitious dissertation project, too ambitious, carried out with a great deal of aplomb. Now, the book is much more than the dissertation, and one of the reasons I have to be grateful for my duties here this afternoon is that they obliged me to read the book far sooner than I was otherwise likely to do. That's how I spent spring break. I was thus able to appreciate for myself how much learning and care went into the transition of Ligita's project from a dissertation to a book, just as I had earlier been privileged to witness at first hand the transition from an ambitious proposal to a splendid dissertation, which Fred Lawrence described as, quote, "by far the best dissertation I have ever had anything to do with, and I've been involved in quite a few splendid ones," end quote. Now, I have to point out that I was one of the dissertations that Fred was involved in. But his judgment about Ligita's dissertation is correct. It was mature, erudite, and thorough, and better than mine. It fittingly received that year's Thomas and Eileen White Dissertation Prize for the best Boston College dissertation in the humanities. And the book is better still, especially in its powerful concluding chapters, Tolle igitur lege. The question posed by her title is a classic of Christian accounts of the work of Christ. Why the cross? Her study traces forward and backward thematic variations, transpositions, on Augustine's proposal that the motive of the cross was somehow to restore the proper subordination of power to justice. But her teleological rereading of the history draws on Lonergan's thematic distinction of two contexts or kinds of justice. The justice of a judge, which is retributive, an eye for an eye, and the justice of the cross, which is in some way a voluntary acceptance of the consequences of sin for the sake of restoring friendship. For Augustine, then, the proposition of the devil was that might makes right, that power orders justice. But the proposition of Christ is that right makes might, even though his cross, in a way, inverts worldly criteria of success. This theme is explored by Ligita in its biblical roots, especially in St. Paul's interpretation of the cross and resurrection, in Augustine's Trinity and City of God, which kind of blew me away, that part. In Anselm, whose famous account of Christ's work set an agenda all later theologians would have to confront, or at least try to work around. In Thomas Aquinas, who attempted to retrieve and reconceive Anselm's fundamental distinction between retribution, pena, and amendment, satisfactio, by making charity rather than supererogation the principle of amendment. And finally, in Bernard Lonergan's relatively unknown writings on the work of Christ, thematized under the heading, The Law of the Cross, interpreted here, in part, as a synthesis of three elements: the Pauline Augustinian motif of power, of justice over power, the Thomist restatement of Anselm's satisfaction theory, and Lonergan's own theory of history, as developed principally in his works Insight and Method in Theology. As if all this were not enough, and it certainly would have been, the author set her argument within the context of an overarching question posed to Western Christians by modern post-Christian secularity. Beginning with four notable accounts of secularity, Charles Taylor, Michael Buckley, Nicholas Boyle, and Lonergan, and drawing on her own experiences in then-Soviet Lithuania, the author asks what role Christians are to play within a secularized cultural and political environment. She articulated a heuristic structure with 5 criteria for a theological response to this question. Her answer, in brief, is supplied by the law of the cross, that Christians are to bear witness to the possibilities of love, even love of one's enemies, that they are to interpret good and evil through the prism of the cross, and seek to bring good out of evil through love, and that they ought to renounce the allure of power. In short, this book must be judged an outstanding success, both as an historical inquiry and as a contribution to contemporary systematic theology. It certainly was a privilege to have had anything at all to do with it. Now, I want to suggest 4 quick questions or thematic developments. First, the primacy of Christ in Lonergan's thought. Everyone has heard the canard about Aquinas' neglect of Christology, which he relegated to a third, final, and incomplete part of his masterpiece. I've never felt there was much justice or wisdom in this appraisal of things. There is, it seems to me, a reason Aquinas took so long to get to his formal Christology, and it is not neglect. He was thinking of Christ the whole time. Let the reader understand he wrote nothing but of Christ. There is also a reason hidden in the providence of God that having done his best, he could not go on. Aquinas was parsing the mystery of Christ, not only in the formal Christology of his Tertia Pars, but with every line he wrote. I doubt Lonergan felt differently, and Ligita supplies the evidence. Largely by force of evidence, Lonergan buried his formal Christology in mid-career textbooks he never even bothered to properly publish. In fact, if you saw the 1961 Gregorian University Press edition of Lonergan's De Verbo Incarnato, you would realize it's just mimeographed notes for students. It's a book than which no uglier can be thought. He buried it in these textbooks written in a dead language and a dead genre. In his devotional opuscula, one discovers in Lonergan a tender affection for Christ. But in his great works, especially Insight and Method, it seems like he's doing endless throat clearing, endless preambles, like a hypochondriac who can't persuade himself he's well enough to get up and start. Among the many achievements of Ligita's splendid book, perhaps none is dearer to me personally than her patient revelation, in effect, that Lonergan was never not writing of the mystery of Christ. Almost imperceptibly, almost as a byproduct, by gathering the threads of his thought into her account of the redemptive work of Christ, Ligita demonstrates triumphantly that Christ was never Lonergan's afterthought, because he was always his forethought, always the keystone to whom the whole edifice of his thought was ordered. Not even Lonergan's most abstruse explorations, explanatory genera and species, generalized emergent probability, the integral heuristic structure of proportionate being, the macroeconomics, yes, even the macroeconomics, were not digressions, because he laid hold of the courage of his conviction that Christ is the head of all creation in its keystone. If they seem like digressions to us, perhaps we are like Augustine blinking his uncomprehending newborn eyes across the pages of Isaiah. As I've been implying, one of the achievements of the book is to show how Lonergan's theory of a dynamic world order, generalized emergent probability, is subsumed in a theological perspective into the immanent intelligibility of the whole Christ head and members, something that is coming to be in history. This coming to be, as Ligita shows, is both personal and interpersonal, because the personal always is interpersonal. This suggests a Trinitarian perspective, which neither Ligita nor Lonergan failed to supply, but here I wish just suggest a further aspect. Because God is one and triune, divine perfection has a twofold ratio. It is at once, and with supreme simplicity, the perfection of pure act and the perfection of order. Similarly, the image of the Trinity in human beings is twofold. The perfection of act is realized in the perfection of our knowing and loving, and the perfection of order is realized in our interpersonal communion. Nor are these opposed alternatives, because, as Ligita put it, the personal always is interpersonal. The image in each of us, the perfection of act, is coming to progressive realization when by self-transcendence we know and love and choose God and one another and our own most selves authentically. Yet the social image, the social and cultural and interpersonal good of order, though really distinct, is coming to be in precisely the same way, through precisely the same acts. This is, I think, a thing that Ligita, in fact, is showing, and a thing that's thematic in another dissertation, Rob Elliott's, to which I should draw grateful attention. Thus, while in created things, the perfection of order and the perfection of act are two distinct perfections, what Ligita's argument suggests very helpfully is that the coming to be of the one is also the coming to be of the other. Let Christ be formed in you. Further, this twofold ratio of perfection applies in its way to the primacy of Christ. Individually, there is no creature more perfect than Christ. But the intrinsic end of the universe is its dynamic, developing good of order. And that order, as Ligita argued, is the whole Christ. Christ, then, as an individual, is the principal created agent of the coming to be of the order that is his body, the whole Christ, head and members. Since his agency is by way of a mutual self-mediation with us, as she also underscores to great effect, the coming to be of Christ individually is in some way one, or united with, inseparable from, the coming to be of the order of the whole Christ. He makes himself in relation to us, so that we make ourselves in relation to him and one another. My last theme is that the primacy of Christ is also the primacy of the cross. Concretely, the just and mysterious law of the cross is the one and the only way that we fallen creatures are made perfect. This is the way Christ too chose to be made perfect. He chose to be made perfect himself in the way that he knew was necessary for us, so that preeminent in all things, he would not ask of us what he had not first done himself. It has been, of course, soundly traditional to ask why the Word became flesh, why he died, how his death was expiatory, in that now neuralgic kind of formulation of things. As far as I know, it was Calvin who first put the question specifically in this form. Why should he die precisely by treachery, by collective denunciation, by abandonment, above all by judicial execution? For Calvin, the answer was that Christ accepted the justice of a judge in substitution for the elect. In this proposal, which finds perhaps its most elegant development in Karl Barth's meditation on the judge judged in our place, Calvin was quietly and perhaps unwittingly erasing Anselm's fundamental distinction between the penalties of vindictive justice, the justice of a judge, and the quite different context of voluntary penance on the basis of repentance and a will to reconciliation. For his part, Anselm, well, I won't bother explaining Anselm. What I do want to do is say this. Anselm did not make thematic the distinction between retributive punishment and contrite satisfaction, which I think is the fundamental disjunction of his work. But he didn't make it make it thematic in terms of the disjunction or the distinction between the justice of a judge and the justice of a cross. Aquinas at least hinted at this in his two discussions of the satisfaction of Christ and the satisfaction of the penitent. And in Lonergan, it becomes a fully thematic element, which Ligita picks out and kind of builds into the architecture of the whole book in a way that really, I think, demonstrates its importance. What Ligita's retrieval of Lonergan on this point makes perspicuous to me in a way that had not quite been before is the fittingness of the cross itself in the manner of Calvin's question. That is, the fittingness of Christ's death by the betrayal and abandonment of his friends and of his own people. And above all, the fittingness of his death by the unjust application of the justice of a judge, as if to reveal all its inadequacy, all the inadequacy of the justice of a judge, to heal the wounds of sin and division, the all but inevitable suborning of civil power by the law of rapine. We become ourselves in one another, but we come to belong to one another and to Christ only through the grace and the mercy and the law of forgiveness. We belong to each other through cruciform love. This is her closing theme. And so we also belong to ourselves, belonging foremost to Christ who loved us and gave himself up for each of us. The coming to be of the whole Christ is through a cruciform love and in no other way. Cruciform love, then, is the one and the only path to true wisdom for us. Nor do we become wiser by speculating whether God might, in some other order of things, have established a different path for us or for Christ. A fool can ask more questions than a sage can answer, and it behooves us to distinguish between possible questions, answerable questions, and good questions. Whether Christ would have come had Adam not fallen is not a question we can answer in a meaningful way, because the answer is a totally different universe God did not give us. But it is also not a good question, because it is not about the wisdom God has revealed to us, the wisdom of the cross. God is not honored by our wisdom, the wisdom of alternative worlds we might have created in accord with our lights. Reading Ligita's book was like meeting her in a new way, and a discovery of the profound influence she has had on me, and of the value of the friendship and the mutual self-mediation she praises so rightly in her book. I thank her for it.
I had the enormous privilege of serving as a reader on Ligita's dissertation, and these last couple of weeks, rereading her book in one fell swoop, gaining a deeper appreciation of her achievement. And it is my great pleasure now, and honour, to be invited by Ligita to say a few words at the launch of this remarkable book. I want to make 3 points. The first is just a general appreciation for her work. The second is just to pick up on some of the many specific insights as she moves across the history of theology. And the third is just to throw out some questions for our discussion. So first off, a general appreciation. This is an extraordinary and inspiring achievement by an extraordinarily accomplished person. As some of you may know, when not publishing books with Cambridge University Press, Ligita worked as a cardiologist in her home country of Lithuania. And as in her cardiology, so in her theology, she treats the heart of the issue in terms of both the intellectual root of the problem and, as a result, liberating our affective motivation to do something about it. For it is probably not an understatement to say that theologians across the centuries have not achieved what the Carroll School of Management teaches its marketing majors on day one: attractive and consistent messaging on a core product. The sheer variety of atonement theories, not to mention the blasphemous and obscene repulsiveness of some of them, begs for a wise and clarifying adjudication if we are to share this liberating core of the Christian gospel effectively, that is, with clarity and consolation. By bringing historical awareness and explanatory insight to one of the most contested and problematic claims of Christianity, namely that humanity is saved by the crucifixion of God's Son as a common criminal, Ligita helps the reader to embrace the truth of this claim more readily. In a nutshell, Ligita shows how the cross is not God reconciling himself to us, as if God needed to placate his wrath at sin by slaughtering his innocent child, who paid the price in our place. A transactional and retributive account some have named the divine child abuse penal substitutionary theory of atonement. But rather, the cross is the means by which God reconciles us to himself. Because in that tensive event, God shows at once the depravity of our sin that we would otherwise rationalize, and the fathomless depth of God's love. More specifically, by revealing God's solution to the problem of evil, the cross empowers us through the Spirit to share as God's friends in that cruciform process of the redemptive healing of history. In other words, to have the courage to face the cross rather than deny or avoid it, as we would otherwise be prone to do. My second point is just to pick up on a couple of specific insights that Ligita brings out. These are just my favorite, but read the book, there are many of them. And in its 10 chapters, we can pair them as 5 pairs of chapters. So chapters 1 and 2 look at the secular context and the biblical revelation. And we've heard Karl Barth mentioned, who always said when you preach, you have the Bible in one hand, but the newspaper or your cell phone in the other hand. And when she discusses all these secular projects of benevolence and universal justice, I think what she shows is that they're basically writing ethical checks they can't metaphysically cash. A bit like Nietzsche when he sort of lampooned George Eliot, a translator of Feuerbach, saying, can you have a Judeo-Christian ethic without a Judeo-Christian metaphysics? In her treatment of the Bible, she shows what she calls the tectonic shift of meaning in the New Testament's announcement of a crucified Messiah that alters our view of God and of suffering. And so new is this message that it creates difficulties for how to explain such a radical and destabilizing revelation. And we see that tension in Augustine's account in the second pair of chapters, chapters 3 and 4. In Augustine, we see the magnificent oppositional rhetoric, justice over power, the eloquent and persuasive grandeur that pits the city of God versus the city of man, caritas over cupiditas. This at times relentlessly binary formulation captures the dramatic confrontation between sin and grace in our concrete historical situation. A later Augustinian thinker applied this dramatic state of affairs to God's own life in terms explicitly opposed to Ligita's intention in the first pages of her book. And I quote this later Augustinian thinker, God's passionate love for humanity is so great that it turns God against himself, his love against his justice. Paragraph 10, Deus Caritas Est. Do you see here a book launch for a heretic? Chapters 5 and 6, the third pair on Aquinas and Anselm. This is a transposition to an explanatory framework that prevents these symbolic binary contrasts from being taken literally and projected metaphysically, with, in the extreme case, catastrophic consequences when God and humanity are ultimately opposed. How is this transposition helpful to an explanatory framework? By offering instead the tripolar vectors, not the binary opposites, of nature, sin, and grace, that saves the significance and meaning of pre-theoretical symbolic discourse, without ascribing contradiction or worse, wickedness to God. The fourth pair, chapters 7 and 8, treat Lonergan. In her marvelous account of Lonergan's turn to converted subjectivity and dynamic historicity, Ligita shows how that classical tripolar dialectic of nature, sin, and grace is transposed into the modern historical terms of progress, decline, and redemption. And this helps clarify the specific contribution of Christian theology to the modern project, not as a secular humanist uncritical cheerleading for progress, nor as a postmodern pessimist shrewdly reminding us of decline, but rather instead the theologian encompasses and transcends both these insights to offer the additional Christian humanist insight on the redemptive law of the cross, such that theologians can say it is precisely the church's distinction from the world that makes it relevant for the world, to quote Joseph Camacho. And thus the church can avoid the opposed errors of seeking, on the one hand, trendy relevance in modernity at the cost of giving away its distinct message. And such the church becomes like an NGO with incense. Or the church, in its anti-modern hyper-traditionalism, adopts what Michael Paul Gallagher says is a fruitless tone of blanket moaning. I'm sure you're familiar with that. By charting this transposition to modern historical consciousness, Ligita can spell out more clearly the resultant shift in our understanding of God's justice, not retributive and punitive, but transformative and reconciling. Not a transactional reckoning of debts owed in some metaphysical calculus, but as our collective interpersonal entrance into a new, deeper, and more meaningful horizon, atonement as attunement, as at one-ment, a journey already pioneered, as Hebrews 12 puts it, by Christ, the perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame. The fifth and final pair of chapters is Ligita's brilliant constructive proposal that extends and secures Lonergan's historically minded and explanatory account of the law of cross, that is, the bringing of good out of evil through love, in continuity with the dynamic, open, upward, but indeterminate process of emergence, in which humanity's damaged and truncated capacity for rational freedom is healed and elevated by grace redemption. 3 closing questions. First one, having charted all these transpositions, a question strikes me, are there any more transpositions? And I wonder, in fact, this is what Ligita is already doing with this brilliant concluding chapters, by situating Lonergan's theological law of the cross within his philosophical account of emergence. This seems to be the seeds of an ecological transposition beyond the theoretical and historical, in which the idea of atonement now reaches back into its biological basis and outwards and upwards into its cosmological openness. Second question. This historical approach I find marvelously clarifying, but is it perhaps too tidy? When Ligita calls her work a teleological reading of the history of theology, my Whiggish alarm bells go off. It's one thing to talk about thematic variations, but does the enumeration of various themes amount to a teleology? I honestly don't know. Others who know this material better that may be a line of critique you might see in reviews. I, for one, find it marvelously clear and teachable, so I'm sticking with it. But one aspect, though, I think might be too tidy, and that's the more basic underlying teleology in the history of philosophy that we find in Lonergan's argument, which Ligita follows, for the priority of interiority analysis over metaphysics, this sort of preference for the term to the subject. My gut instinct is that we should shift away from the, to my mind, unproductive question of the priority of metaphysics over cognitional analysis, and put it in a more neutral way, not in terms of priority, but in terms of intensification. That is, a journey of intensification from a creation metaphysics, that is, a sense of natural religious wonder in the face of the realization there is something, not nothing, although, as Chesterton says, about that something, i.e. existence, we are often unthinking and often unthanking, which is perhaps why we need the next step of this journey of intensification, from a creation metaphysics to a paschal dramatics, specifically Christian historical dynamics of the cross and resurrection, a sense of the amazing grace of the new life through forgiveness and so on. Much like Robert Sokolowski's wonderful phrase, where he says that if in creation God makes life from nothing, then in redemption God brings new life from the deeper nothingness of sin and death. And so the goal is not to determine the winner between metaphysics and interiority analysis, but rather simply to select the appropriate philosophical tools within these two distinct approaches that are most appropriate to elucidate whichever particular theological claim is under discussion. If then we're dealing with a theology of creation, then presumably metaphysical concepts such as being and participation fit the bill. But if our theological focus shifts to redemption, then presumably the historical and hermeneutical methods grounded in interiority analysis that deal with the interpretation of particular events mediated by language, distorted by power, subject to conversion and emancipation and so on, those terms fit better. So I would suggest maybe framing the issue in these more neutral terms, not priority but intensification, relieves us of the need to establish a pecking order between what are just admissibly diverse centers of philosophical and theological gravity. Third and final closing question for Ligita, to conclude where her book starts, in the context of the not-so-post-imperial Eastern European politics. How, if at all, does this theology of the cross inform and even alter our just war theory? Does the counsel to non-violently bring good out of evil delegitimize the justifiable use of force against an unjust invader. That Jeremy's question he picked up on Ligita, what should we then put up with? This seems especially poignant in light of current events in Ukraine and Ligita's moving opening to her book on her family and her history in Eastern Europe under Russian tutelage. To put it pointedly, would you, Ligita, if Russian tanks roll into Lithuania next, counsel non-violence, which is pretty much all we have when there are no other alternatives? Or do you, when there is still an alternative, that is, an existing state capable of organized forceful resistance, support that armed resistance? Yes, violence gets out of hand, as you say in your book, but so does appeasement. And you can see here my British history coming up. Chamberlain's disastrous policy in the Munich conference in 1938, I think. The remorse at abandoning the Czechoslovakian, and so on. Perhaps the response to my question, what policy difference does this theology of the cross make, emerges in the just post-Bellum thought, which I know next to nothing about. That is increasing the odds of a post-conflict resolution that looks more like World War II's Marshall Plan than World War I's Hang the Kaiser, Treaty of Versailles. In any case, by way of conclusion, I want to thank you, Ligita, for writing such an excellent, clarifying and inspiring book. We are in your debt, and it is our condign work of satisfaction to you to purchase a copy of this book.
If today you hear God's voice, harden not your heart. This is the message of the responsorial psalm for this past Sunday, the third Sunday of Lent. Having prayed Psalm 95 as part of the Lord's so many times, I think these words express so well the call that is also at the heart of my argument in this book, which the Lonergan Center so kindly arranged to celebrate today. The psalm, and I hope in some small way, the book as well, invites us not to harden our hearts in the face of evil, and not to rebel against God, as did the Israelites at Massa and Meribah, quarreling among themselves and testing the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? Exodus 17:7. It is not accidental that in the letter to the Hebrews exposition of Psalm 95, chapter 3, the capacity to not harden our hearts is linked to the mystery of our participation in Christ. What? See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has an evil, unbelieving heart that forsakes the living God, but exhort one another each day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may become hardened by sin's deception. For we have become partners with Christ, if in fact we hold our initial confidence firm until the end. As it says, oh, that today you would listen as he speaks, do not harden your hearts. Hebrew 3:12-15. As Psalm 95 and the Hebrews make clear, putting God to the test essentially means distrusting that God is willing and able to deliver us from evil, indeed, to transform evil into good. If we distrust that, we remain restless, as the end of Psalm 95 warns us. They will never enter into the resting place I had set aside for them. It is also by trusting God's transformative love power that we're able to renounce our right to retaliate and even to forgive our enemies. I suspect by now that some of you have perhaps started stirring in your seats, at least internally, wondering whether I will be simply preaching for the next 40 minutes, which I would love to do, dodging all the relevant questions and friendly criticisms expressed especially by Dominic and Jenny. Be at peace, I won't. But I thought that starting these reflections with Psalm 95, that's, well, the theme of my book and the liturgical time. So what shall I do over the next 40 minutes, perhaps 30 minutes or so? I first want to express my gratitude to everyone involved in making this event possible, and especially to Jeremy, Wilkins, and Dominic Doyle, whose kind comments and friendly criticisms I found both deeply moving and also very stimulating. I'm deeply indebted to both of them as their former student and now colleague. Initially, I thought of simply rebutting each of the potential and actual objections in a style of a good Thomist, responding point to point and hopefully tearing them apart one by one. Not the objectors, but the objections. However, such a way of proceeding would make this event too much like a dissertation defense. And I believe that no one, even the most hopeless, should be subjected to this twice. And I did my work 3 years ago. What I'm going to do is this. First, I want to say a few words about how the book came to be, especially by reflecting on my own historical context. Second, I will summarize the key question that my book considers and present an outline of my argument as I see it. My colleagues already presented their perspective on the outline. Lastly, I will speak of some of the questions that I tentatively raised in the book and about which I'm still wondering in today's context. To some extent, these questions overlap with the questions raised by Dominic Doyle in his gracious response to my book. So first, what are some major formative experiences and the origins of the book? As you heard, the book largely draws on my research that I've done for my doctoral dissertation here at Boston College. However, the roots of my theological reflection go much deeper than that. Permit me to cite some of what I shared in the prologue to my book, and more recently in the blog that the publisher of my book, Cambridge University Press, asked me to write. So how did I come to write this book? The reasons go as deep as my genes. Reflecting on the cross seems to be in the blood of us Lithuanian Catholics. The famous hill of crosses near Šiauliai, the many crosses along our roads, and finally, the religious symbol par excellence of our country, the wooden figure of Christ shortly before his crucifixion. We call it Rūpintojėlis, the word Christ, or the one who cares. They speak for themselves. In the context of prolonged historical suffering, these symbols express the merging of religious and national affectivity and imagination. Not surprisingly, my first ever article in theology was written on what I called post-Gulag Christology. In a sense, then, this book can be seen as a fruit of a conscious, even if indirect, attempt to own my cultural heritage. Furthermore, it also has roots in my personal experience. As you heard, it was an experience of growing up in an occupied country, torn by communist repressions. Living under a totalitarian regime taught us how easily the plundered becomes the plunderer and makes way for the flourishing of human vices in the name of justice. So-called justice, for instance, had been invoked when my father's family was squeezed into animal wagons without any belongings or the food and sent on the long journey to Siberia, nearly 4,000 miles away. An enemy of the people, my father, was just 5. When the survivors were allowed to return, he was 16. However, I have also seen another kind of justice, a redemptive justice, or the justice of the cross, as Lonergan calls it. This justice was about absorbing evil and transforming it into good, about persevering in love, gratitude, and wonder, no matter what, about choosing a difficult good. This kind of justice was operative when people rose to non-violently resist the communist regime in the so-called singing revolution of the Baltic countries. We stood together and sang, even against the Russian tanks, on January 13, 1991. The tanks were not immediately stopped by the singing human world, and yet the lives of the people whose crushed bodies literally absorbed the evil of the military madness were not wasted. Their sacrifice somehow made a difference. Some weeks later, other countries started recognizing Lithuania's independence, and Russia gradually withdrew its arms from our land then. These words, which come from my prologue, written when I began my project, now cannot be read without reminding me of a deep sorrow for the current plight of the Ukrainian people. Their predicament reinforces the need to carefully discern between the abuse of power in the name of justice and the power of transformative justice, and to take responsibility for one's actions in history. In these old and new contexts, the justice of the cross still reminds us that forgiveness is indeed to be prized as the key to maintaining the Christian family resemblance, and perhaps the highest form of moral protest in the face of evil. At the same time, as my book makes explicit, the law of the cross always calls the perpetrators to repentance for their sins. The justice that rolls down like waters from the cross cannot be bereft of its prophetic dimension. In the writing of the book, the historical experiences recalled above converge with many other personal experiences. Not the least, there were the experiences of being shaped by the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius and by Eucharistic spirituality as a sister of the Eucharistic Jesus, of living through a transition from an atheistic society by force to a secular society by choice, of a theological formation and teaching at Boston College, which encouraged me to live up to the best implications of theology as faith, seeking, and understanding. I was blessed with invaluable opportunities to learn from great minds, and also those who made those minds from the past accessible to me, including everyone with whom I took classes at BC, but especially those who were involved in my theological formation through their most generous mentorship and through friendships. Most importantly, there is my dissertation committee, headed by Jeremy Wilkins, which included also Sean Copeland, Dominic Doyle, and Fred Lawrence, and those who accompanied me on some sections of my road, some of them present in this room today, especially Dr. Steve Wilkins, Dr. Burns, Patrick Byrne, and all scholars and friends at the Lonergan Center, as well as Neil Armeroth, Thomas Groom, Marianne Hinsdale, Richard Gallardi, Thomas Stegman, Brian Rabin, Lisa Cahill, Steve Pope, Catherine Cornell, and very importantly, Father Ken Hughes, who supported me personally and helped editing my work. And I haven't mentioned all of them, but there's there are so many people to whom I am really deeply grateful. Though it might come as a surprise to those who primarily know me as a Lonergan scholar, it was taking a course on St. Augustine with Dr. Douglas Finn that I started thinking about this project. I found myself pondering what Augustine's claim that God chose to save us by preferring justice over power in Book 13 of the Trinity might mean. The more I read Augustine, the more convinced I became that there's clearly a genetic development from Augustine to Aquinas to Lonergan. This made me approach Jeremy Wilkins, who eventually became my mentor and thesis director, with a plan to write on the justice of the cross, whatever that meant. Jeremy was instrumental in skillfully steering me in the right direction and helping me clarify my thinking, confused as it was, and above all, together with others, by his example and friendship teaching me what theology as conversation looks like. So having sketched my road of wondering about the cross, permit me now to turn to the second, much shorter, part of my presentation, the key question of my book and the summary of my argument as I see it. If the prophet Amos was right, justice and righteousness cannot be separated. In a passage that so nicely fits with the weather, predicted weather at least, in Boston today, Amos exclaimed, "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Amos 5:24. But how can we think of the justice that concerns the cross event, the ignominious and humiliating suffering and death of Christ, the most righteous victim? Even if the blood and water from his side washed us of the tarnish of sin, was it just for God to spill it? And is the affirmative answer that praises the sublime justice of the cross, such as Augustine's, not a misnomer? After all, what is there that can be said to be just in the suffering and killing of an innocent victim? In what sense is the trauma of salvation not a displaced act of divine retribution, or even terrorism, as some have suggested, but the revelation of infinite love? Should we pit God's saving love against divine justice? Or is there a more fruitful way out? An easy way out, it seems, would be to conceive of the justice of the cross exclusively in terms of Christ's resurrection. In the triumph of the Easter morning, there is no longer any doubt on whose side God is. Both God's justice and the innocent sufferer is vindicated and raised up. Or perhaps one should forget the cross altogether as a formidable instrument of torture that cannot carry any positive symbolism, and instead argue for the salvific value of Christ's incarnation or ministry. But do these answers really satisfy us vis-a-vis the Christian story? Is it not that we are still wondering about the meaning of St. Paul's "Christ died for us and for our sins"? Do we not still ask, why did God, in God's infinite wisdom and goodness, choose to allow Jesus to face the blinding darkness of Golgotha? And why does God save us, not from death, but through death, as Richard Bauckham once pointed out? In other words, why the cross? What was fitting or just about God's choice to save us in this way? Is there a value to the twilight that precedes the dawn? These are the questions that animated my research and intellectual struggle while writing this book. And to sum up, the book reconsiders the very notion of the justice of the cross. How is the justice of the cross just? By drawing on Lonergan's development of the Augustinian Thomas tradition, I argue that the justice of the cross concerns the righteousness of order, not transaction or retribution, as some post-Anselmian accounts of atonement suggest. Correspondingly, the justice of the cross regards the fittingness, not the necessity, of the divine solution to the problem of evil. It was fitting that a problem of a disordered love was answered, not by coercion or by divine intervention without human involvement, but by a reordering of human love through a gift of friendship with and in Christ. This is not to deny that the cross remains a paradoxical symbol, as is the twilight. For there is a radical difference between the darkness of suffering as inflicted and of suffering as willingly accepted out of love, just as Christ did. As Lonergan pointed out, though physically the crucifixion was one reality, morally it was two. As willed by the crucifiers, it was the most heinous evil and injustice. But as accepted by Christ out of love, and by all those united to him in love, it was and continues to be the effective sign of the supreme righteousness of God, or to use a winsome phrase that I borrow from Greg Doyle, the no matter whatness of God. Third, remaining questions and concerns, which are many. I would like to spend the remaining 10 minutes or so by addressing some of the questions raised by Jeremy's and especially Dominic's responses today. First, there are some methodological concerns expressed by Dominic. He wonders to what extent my teleological reading of the history of theology is justified. That is, whether we do justice to any author in his own right if we read him or her in the light of later developments. In response, I wonder whether a reading that is not teleological is at all possible. Arguing against the teleological character of any interpretation, it seems, would require first to disprove that all knowledge, but not history, I beg for a distinction here, is cumulative and progressive, even if this does not exclude dead ends and mistaken positions. Second, denying a teleological aspect of any interpretation seems to be tantamount to dismissing Gadamer's insight that interpretation regards the fusion of two horizons, that of the text and of the reader. If we agree that a competent reader is not just a blank slate, some kind of evaluation of the earlier in the light of the later will always be at work in shaping or his horizon. Thus, by my lights, the risk of eisegesis, that is, of reading into the text, which I suspect is Dominic's real concern, does not seem to be any greater simply because one chooses to make explicit her teleological reading. Of itself, a teleological reading, that is a reading of the text in the light of later developments, does not make an interpretation lopsided. I think both excessive tiding and excessive antagonizing are equally possible. The real question is how well the proposed transpositions, be they genetic, complementary, or dialectically opposed, are supported by the evidence that the interpreter brings to the table. And the answer to this question, I can only defer to the judgment of all my wise and competent readers, which is all of you. More specifically, Dominic wonders whether the more basic underlying theology presumed in the purported relegation of the priority of metaphysics is too tidy. In the earlier draft, which I received a few days ago, he admitted that for him, the major stumbling block in Lonergan's prioritization of intentionality analysis over is Lonergan's prioritization of intentionality analysis over metaphysics. So Dominic suggested that this putting one against the other, or preferring one over the other, is unproductive and proposes a more neutral framing of the issue as one of intensification, from a creation metaphysics to a historical classical hermeneutics. In its own right, this is a very fascinating, insightful, and promising proposal. I only wonder about two things. First, of course, what do we mean by priority? If it is a first in any given order, is not, in the order of knowing, our presence to ourselves as subjects more fundamental than our presence to the objects? Second, to what extent an intensification is an alternative or complementary to specifically Lonergan's critical metaphysics, as grounded in self-appropriation as his first philosophy? Does not the natural reasoning of any kind, be it Thomas Aristotelian metaphysics or Lonergan's self-appropriation, serve as a preamble of faith that always needs a dramatic intensification that is grounded in God's self-communication? In other words, that both intentionality analysis and metaphysics call for an intensification, I do not doubt, and I like the term a lot. My question rather is this: can the upholding of the Aristotelian metaphysics as the first philosophy today be truly capable of unifying different departments of knowledge? If not, I dare think that Aristotle himself would no longer count such a philosophy as the first philosophy. This leads us to another question posed by Dominic, which probably I will skip because this is kind of technical and I think it disappeared from the later version. I'll just go then to the more challenging and far more important question. The last question, which Dominic raised, about the just war implications of the theology of the cross for thinking about the current situation, especially in light of what's going on in Ukraine. So I understand this to be a question: how should we think of the transformation of evil into good in the context of malevolence that feeds on the most outrageous rationalizations and unbridled hatred, and marches forward by spreading terror, by trampling on human dignity and rights, and by destroying everything that gets in its way? Since I wrote my book, I have been pondering extensively about this question. The question basically concerns the meaning of the love of enemies. In a way, that question foregrounds the need for not just an adequate theodicy, but also for an adequate anthropodicy. The concern so well voiced by Johann Baptist Metz's eschatological questioning of God. In response, I first want to say that the transformation of evil into good in and of itself does not imply strict pacifism. It does, however, demand a careful discernment and an antecedent willingness to forgive one's enemies, that is, to renounce one's right to retaliate. Let me first clarify the former, the need for discernment, by citing my book once again. What Lonergan's beautiful meditation on the meaning of the law of the cross provokes us to press further in our quest for understanding the ethical implications of the ontological ambiguity of suffering. If Lonergan's account is to be developed in the context of modern moral concerns, we need to ask, what are some criteria for not putting up with evil? While Lonergan never asked such a question directly, he was concerned with the possibility of a self-denial slipping over into demonic, quote unquote, with the result of the exultant destructiveness of oneself and of others, unquote. The key to clarifying this issue, I think, lies in understanding that our assimilation to Christ does not take away our autonomy or intelligence or reasonableness or responsibility, but makes them truly free and truly possible. The major criterion for the patient absorption of human evils is the evil's transformation into good in all of its historical concreteness. Consequently, because the good is always concrete, this absorption of evil has to be the work of someone who authentically discerns the best way forward in a concrete situation of evil and suffering, and does that creatively. The precept, do not return evil for evil, is not identical to just suck it up. Specific to different contexts, there are different ways of moving forward without perpetuating evil. But to the contrary, resisting it in a non-violent way, in some sense. The victory of love is the victory of the subject who knows herself as loved, and therefore owns herself through mutual self-mediation with Christ, thereby allowing Christ to own her, so that together, through that, they pass into life according to the law of the cross. And this was what I had in my book. I agree this needs to be developed further, which was the challenge I took up recently in my writing on human solidarity. Permit me to share some thoughts that I hope will clarify my position. The violence that is implied in the quotation you just heard does not concern the use of any force, but rather following one's violent impulse to retaliate, to make the other heard simply because you hear so much. In this light, the transformation of evil into good does not necessarily imply a refusal to use force when it comes to stopping evil. And yet, as argued by a number of contemporary voices, perhaps most convincingly by Patrick Riordan at the University of Oxford, without some sort of non-violent resolution of the social and political conflicts, there is no sustainable peace. In this sense, the law of the cross has some genuine universal significance. Okay, I'm skipping just to make sure that we're not going over time. Well, still, for reconciliation to be truly possible, injustice first must be acknowledged, lamented, resisted, and stopped. This is so because reconciliation is never unilateral. It takes both forgiveness on the side of the victim and repentance on the side of the victimizer. Thus, an uncritical advocacy of forgiveness, that is, of transcending resentments and renouncing the right to seek rigid justice, needs to be problematized. In some sense, this might also mean acknowledging the virtuousness of anger. And yet, the Christian tradition conceives returning good for evil as the highest form of moral protest. This is so because, far from overlooking the crime, forgiveness includes the acknowledgement that perpetrators have done something that would warrant blame and resentment. Otherwise, there would be no need to forgive. Moreover, properly understood, forgiveness manifests an authentic power, the power of love to expose the irrationality and falsehood of evil by refusing to pay in kind. In the Pauline idiom, by feeding our enemies, we heap burning coals on their heads. So from Calvary to the civil rights movement, to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, to the combatants of peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not returning evil in kind shifts the odds for the possibility of dialogue and conversion, thus setting up the conditions for a more sustainable peace and justice. To be sure, following the law of the cross does not mean taking away the responsibility of the wrongdoer to stop injustice, to seek forgiveness, to repent for their wrongdoings, and to mend for their sins, In other words, the law of the cross treats the victimizers as potential converts, or in the words of Jeremy Wilkins, potential penitents. By not returning evil in kind, one refuses to collude with the victimizers' defacing of themselves. One does not give up on them. One knows that only the love that is not scared off by the hell in human hearts and societies can truly liberate them. To stress, once again, while forgiveness indeed calls for renouncing resentment and strict retribution or revenge, this renouncement does not mean putting up with evil. Reconciliation is never unilateral. The evil must be stopped, and amendments must be made so that forgiveness will lead to a genuine reconciliation. The problematic aspect of undermining these stipulations can be illustrated by the concerns raised by a number of the church leaders with regard to Pope Francis's initiative during the Via Crucis, in the Way of the Cross in Rome this past Lent, if you remember the media reporting on that. Many judged his calling on Christ to bring adversaries to shake hands in the context of his arrangement for two women, one Ukrainian and one Russian, to carry the cross together, in many respects was judged to be untimely. This was especially elegantly expressed by Vatican's own ambassador to Ukraine, Archbishop Visvaldas Kulbokas, who happens to be a Lithuanian, by the way. He said, reconciliation must come when aggression is stopped. This also reminds me of one priest's remark in a homily I recently heard. He said, Jesus does not ask us to turn the same cheek to our enemy, but the other. On this, I'll probably stop because I'm just conscious of time. And I want to thank you all for coming and for really taking such an extended period of your busy time just to being present and celebrating here. I know there's a cake, but I was just waiting for us. But I really wanted to express my appreciation first, and also I'm eager to hear your questions and your comments. We have about 10 minutes more. It was supposed to be an hour and a half, I guess. So we still have about 10 minutes. If you have any comments or questions to Jeremy or Dominic or me, please feel free to go ahead and voice them.
I am going to ask if anybody has questions that they wave me down for a microphone so that the folks on our Zoom can hear your question. Everybody's thinking about cake.
I'm Jean Bartunek from the School of Management, but not the marketing department. So this is just a quick question. I was on a Zoom call with some people before coming over here, where we were talking about the fact that resistance is often associated in our field with resistance to change, and as a bad thing. And what we were thinking about is how can we liberate resistance to make it not tethered to change. But listening to you talk, there was no overlap between what you were talking about and the way we were talking. But it makes me think about, you must have some images of resistance in terms of what you were saying. Even in terms of like questions of just wars, for example, or something like that. So if you can you tell the three people through me that I'm working with something that would be helpful for us based on your book, based on your work about resistance?
question. One thing which comes to my mind as I'm thinking of resistance in terms of images is this symbol which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, which is a symbol of Christ sitting with one of his hands just put to his cheek and kind of pondering the ills of humanity just before his crucifixion. So we associate that image with Christ's solidarity with us in our suffering. And I think the notion of solidarity is the term which comes to my mind when I think of resistance. So it involves two kinds of kinetic solidarity, if you wish, which are asymmetrical in some sense. So on the side of victims, so solidarity with victims, requires a different kind of change than the solidarity with the victimizers or potential convicts or penitents. But both involve change. So on the side of the victims, the change which can only happen by grace is to let go of resentment and kind of drive to revenge, which is to open up to forgiveness. And it involves a change which is a kind of radical change from a person who is closed and oneself, perhaps closed because of the hurt, to someone who is risking to become vulnerable. On the other side, there's this solidarity with the victimizers, which is a very different kind of solidarity. It's a kind of tough solidarity, where they are held responsible, so the change then happens on their side, not so much on the side of ones who are trying to be in solidarity with them. And the change which happens in that context is their openness to let go of their selfishness, of their rationalization. Basically, the change involves conversion in every sense, intellectual, moral, religious conversion. And so also it involves repentance. And it's a change which, again, involves not just them, but becomes a condition for a possibility of the change of the society. So in what sense both of these kinds of solidarity are resistance? Well, I think they are, because they resist the prevalent cultural norms or kind of understandings shaped by what we think our role in the society is to be tough, to have exclusive rights, to access to the exclusive clubs, and I mean I'm just making up on the spot, but this is I think something which comes to my mind, and I'm really grateful for your question.
Time is short. Thank you for your presentation. I think your book is fantastic, as I've told you. I want to just ask you, is it always a good idea to forgive? It seems to me that what you said was, it takes two to be reconciled. We have this image from Luke's gospel, Father, forgive them for they don't know what they do, from the cross. Not in response to repentance, but an acknowledgement that the evil they were doing was much greater than they thought they were doing, if they recognized they were doing evil at all. But going back to the situation in Ukraine, is it something? Do you want to encourage Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting for their lives to forgive the Russians, or do you want to say the time for forgiveness that's really obligatory is when perpetrators have repented and renounced the evil they've done, which then prepares the way for reconciliation. So the question, I guess, is forgiving always obligatory? Is it always even a good idea in the face of obstinate, self-justifying evildoers?
And I also think this is a question whether we can give unconditional forgiveness of some sort. Well, I do believe that forgiveness is essential. I also would like to distinguish forgiveness and forgetting. So I think that very often when we say, should they start forgiving right now or postpone, forgiveness until the aggression is stopped and the Russians start repenting, which might be not true at any time, I would say that if forgiveness means an antecedent willingness to not retaliate, then yes, they should start forgiving right away. And all of the Eastern Europeans need to start forgiving right away. I find it very difficult, psychologically and spiritually, in every sense. But this forgiveness does not mean forgetting, or it does not mean silencing the lament. It does not mean some sort of passivity, not doing everything possible to stop the war. Also as it is necessary to fight back in order to stop the military aggression. So I associate forgiveness with kind of a disposition, only to do what is necessary to stop the evil, but not to retaliate, not to take more steps than necessary to establish justice.
You could, last point, sorry, but you could legitimately resent what's being done that's unjust and not retaliate.
Can you say it again, please? I didn't.
You can legitimately resent injustice and not retaliate. That is, you can still not forgive and refuse to retaliate.
Well, it depends then what you mean by forgiveness. By forgiveness, I mean specifically the refusal or announcement to retaliate.
Yeah, I'd say it means renouncing legitimate resentment.
Both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think we are out of time. I just want to make a note for everyone to please stop and get a piece of cake on your way out. We have 3 books here for sale, and then you're also welcome, or if we run out, you're welcome to grab a flyer for a discount code from Cambridge University Press. And I'd just like to thank Ligita one more time and congratulate her.